Hi everybody, Frank here. Today we're resuming our training on Microsoft's project. In our last video we left off on work resources, and today we're going to pick up and talk about the other types of resources in Microsoft project and how they can be used and why it's important to use different resources for different purposes. So I've already opened up and renamed this video file, this MPP file, as video5.mpp. So feel free to follow along from the last video. So once you're open and ready to go, I'm in the Gantt view currently. Let's change that to the resource sheet view. And remember, you can click this drop down here and click resource sheet. So you can see we have our 4 work resources, and we're actually going to add a new type of resource. Let's see what other types of resources are available. There's material and there's cost. So let's add a material row first, and let's talk about the difference between material and work. So work is accrued as a function of time. Material is accrued as a function of units. So let's go ahead and put an example in our project, and then I think it'll start to make sense. So let's call this first material steel, just for our example. And under this material row, we're going to kind of want to name the units of measurement. So if you were doing concrete, it could be, volume, like, cubic yards, or in our case for steel, let's just say that we're buying steel by the pound. So under material, we'll put LB, just short for pound, and then we'll skip group for now. And you'll notice that some of these columns, we actually can't enter data like we could on for the work resources. So if I try to enter like 1, 2, 3, it won't let me do that for max because this is a consumable material. This is not a person or a resource. So this, in theory, doesn't have a limit. You could buy as much steel as you wanted. So project doesn't let us enter data there. So we're going to skip that. And I think similarly here, we can't enter an overtime rate, right? Because regardless of how much steel you purchase, you're going to buy it at a standard rate. You're not going to pay more for buying more, right? At an overtime rate. You should probably get a discount. So project does let us enter a standard rate, which is, in our case, we're going to enter it per pound. I'm setting up the units that I want to enter that for. And I can also do a cost per use. So if I had to pay $100 for steel to be delivered, right, and I wanted to buy, 1,000 pounds of steel, you could use a cost per use in a similar function, kind of like how we use that on the widget cutter. The first cost per use, even though we pay per hour for some service, there might be a setup fee. So same kind of thing. So that makes sense. So let's just say we buy steel for $3.50 per pound. You'll notice that I can't really enter anything in these other columns because it doesn't make sense for a material, a purchased material. So now I have steel. I have steel material. My unit is pound, and my rate is $3.50 per unit. So let's go back to the task sheet and let's put steel into our project just to show an example. Or let's go to the Gantt chart view. So we have the Gantt chart. So in the Gantt view, under my widget cutter, so I've already got a resource. I've got my widget cutter, which already has $870 worth of labor. Let's double click that and open that. But when I cut my widget and I spend a certain amount of time, I have one widget cutter. That's what the unit means. I have one widget cutter working for that amount of time. I'm also going to be consuming my material, my steel or whatever your material might be in your project. So I'm going to select another resource. I'm going to add another resource, and I'm going to choose steel. And you'll notice that under units, it selected that material column that I defined it as. So in my case, I defined steel as per pound. Now you could do, per meter, you could do volume. It depends on what your material is. It could be, ton. However you purchase material in volume and weight, that's what you want to set up in project. So in our case, we had $3.50 per pound. So if I say 1 pound and hit OK, it'll add that $3.50. And you can see that. Now you'll notice that I can't enter the cost here because the cost is not editable. I have to enter how many units of steel I'm going to consume for this activity. So if I am actually going to use 1,000 pounds of steel and I hit enter and hit OK, you'll notice that now my cost is $4,370. It added all the cost of the widget cutter, the cost of the tool, and it added an additional $3,500 for steel consumption. Okay, next let's talk about the other resource that we didn't talk about yet, which is cost. So let's go back to our resource sheet and let's add the last type of resource, which is cost. Okay, so for cost, you'll notice similarly, I can't enter most of the data. So what is cost? So cost is not work, it's not material. Cost are things that are basically one-time costs or specific costs that you want to add. So I'll give you an example. So on our project, if we were fabricating, pressure vessels, for example, we would be using steel, we would be using workers and tooling, but we would also have, ASME certification, right? So when you certify pressure vessels in the US, they need to be ASME certified, ASME U-stamped, it's called. Anyways, I can't set a rate or I can't set any data for this. I'm just setting up this as a class. It's almost like this is a classifier. So as I add cost to my project whenever I want, I can throw it into this bucket called ASME certification. So let's go back to the task sheet and let's see how this is used. So in the task sheet view, which doesn't have the Gantt chart, it just has our tasks. It's a little cleaner to work in. Let's say after we use this steel, we also have to pay a certification fee, right? So now I can choose ASME certification, and the difference is I directly enter the cost. So if this cost is $500, I can enter that and hit OK. And if on another task I want to use ASME certification, I can just directly enter a different cost if it's different on a different activity. Maybe that's $700. Okay? And you can see that's what the use of cost is. Cost makes it so that it's a little bit more manual. You have to manually enter in the cost on every task, but it's good for things that are kind of one-offs that you want to specifically enter every time. Maybe it's a little unique. Versus material, which is consumed, and usually the cost is a function of how much material you consume. Anything that's a function of how much is used should be a material in Microsoft's project. Anything that's a function of duration, how long it takes, how many hours you spend doing it, that should be a work. And anything that's kind of a catch-all, like one-time certifications, right? Maybe building inspector fee. You usually don't pay the building inspector per hour, right? You usually have to pay maybe a one-time fee. So it wouldn't make sense to set up our building inspector hourly, and obviously it wouldn't make sense to set it up as a material, so we would set it up as a cost. And then when we had to issue maybe a permitting fee or a building inspection fee, that's where it makes sense to put these types of project costs in the cost bucket. So that's everything from today's video. We now understand what are all the different types of resources that can be on a project, where it makes sense to use them, and why we want to use them. One last thing I think before we close is I'd like to just talk about the accrual. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but in project you have a choice to either accrue cost at the beginning of a task. So as soon as you start, you have to pay, and that might make sense for something like a permit. Maybe you have to pay up front. So on the first date of that task starting, you have to pay the fee. That might make sense. And then you might have prorated. So usually that's for tasks that accrue cost over time. So for the widget cutter, maybe we don't have to pay up front for that widget cutter's use, or we don't have to pay for our workers up front. Their cost is accrued over time, and that would fit the prorated bucket. And then there's end. So maybe if there's a contractor that, and the contract terms are, you are going to, complete the work and then get paid for the contractor, that you could set that up to accrue at the end. And it doesn't have an impact on the total cost of the schedule, of course. If we go back to the task sheet, the total cost of all these tasks and activities would remain the same because they still are going to get done. But the difference will come into when we get into reporting and we start breaking down into our cost reporting and our cash flow. Depending on what you choose here could affect when your cash flow analysis gets hit with that cost. So that gives you a little more fine-tuning for very accurate representation, and that can be really useful, especially for large costs when you're trying to control if they hit in this fiscal year, maybe they hit next fiscal year. That lets you start to dial some of those levers to control when the costs hit your project. So I just wanted to explain why that's important and what those tools can be used for. But it's pretty basic. We're going to set up these 3 different types of costs, and we're going to set up the proper rates and use them in the proper way, and then Project can calculate all of our project costs automatically. It's very good. So thanks for joining today. I hope this was informative. In our next lesson, we'll be moving on to a different task. I think we'll go into reporting. So stay with us, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.